Hello, welcome to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small.
And I'm Paul Ogden.
We are coming to you today on December 8th, 2012.
From an undisclosed location, Mark.
And always in an undisclosed location.
Right.
It's a warm day for me because I'm sitting over the vent for the furnace here. But it's kind of chilly and gray outside. Our guests today, as we're going to discuss Abraham Lincoln and events around the Civil War because of the movie Abraham Lincoln that we just saw that's recently out. Our guests are Tom Ayer. Welcome to the show, Tom. It's your first time on here. Hope you haven't been scared off by things you've heard.
Tom, so far, so great.
Tom is a fundraiser for not-for-profit corporations and also a lawyer here in Indianapolis. Do you have a blog or anything?
No, I don't.
You're the only one of the four of us.
I should get that done. I've got 3 kids. That keeps me plenty busy.
Are you an American without a blog? I mean, this is... you got a green card? And Matt Stone, who's been on our show several times before. Many times.
Yes, and the youngest member of our panel today, as she's pointed out like 3 times.
That was really very happy for us to hear. He's a blogger on Indie Student. And the median age of the Rolling Stones is higher than the United States Supreme Court.
I saw that.
That's if you count Keith Richards as living.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And we're here with our audience today. We're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln events around the Civil War. First of all, the movie Lincoln is out. It's directed by Steven Spielberg. Stars Daniel Day-Lewis, and the buzz is he's got a lock on the Oscar. He did a decent job of playing Lincoln, although I thought he had too many soliloquies. Sally Field plays Mary Todd Lincoln. She really didn't have that much. They didn't give her very much of a part.
She did act crazy, and that was the important thing.
Yeah, Tommy Lee Jones plays a guy with a bad wig, Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania. Hal Holbrook surprised me.
What's in Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania?
And then the guy that I think is going to get the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor was James Spader.
I did like Spader.
Who was he?
He played W.N. Bilbo, who was the guy that was bribing members of Congress and stuff. I mean, and he was on Boston Legal, and I just thought that he was hilarious in that role. But to go before that in time, because Lincoln focuses on the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States that ended slavery, and it really focuses on about 4.5 months in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. So the issue of slavery is really front and center for the movie, and we're going to discuss in the first segment here slavery as it existed at the beginning of this country, when this country began, when the Constitution was framed. Europeans arrived here, there was no slavery here. We came here, the first African Americans that came here were indentured servants. There wasn't really slavery as such. And then I think people just realized they could do it.
Well, let's be more specific about here, because the Spaniards and the Portuguese started enslaving natives almost immediately in South America when they started colonizing that area. So it wasn't like slavery was a brand new concept. They just found that the natives of the Americas died out really quickly due to the communal diseases and stuff, because they had not built up the immunities for the common diseases that Europeans carried, and also alcoholism really struck them really hard.
Well, and also, first of all, slavery goes back in human history to, I mean, it's in the Old Testament, and Greeks, Romans practiced it, so it's been an evil in human society for a long time. But in North America, when the Europeans settled here, they found that the indigenous tribes weren't suited to slavery because they wouldn't tolerate it. They had rebellions from the indigenous peoples.
Well, and the Spain, there's a priest in Spain wrote a big, huge book about how immoral it was to enslave the natives. Thought they should be spreading the Christian message to them and stuff like that. Eventually, it just became taboo for specifically to enslave natives.
Whereas when Christopher Columbus arrived here, he wrote a letter, addressed it to the Queen and King, saying, with only 50 men, we can subjugate these peoples here in the name of the King and Jesus Christ. So
Christopher Columbus might be the most overrated historical figure of the 20th century.
He directed a couple of good Harry Potter films. But we get into the time when all of a sudden we've got slavery here, and that the 1600s, going into the 1700s, it becomes an institution, particularly in the southern states, although slavery was in the northern states too. I mean, there were slave markets in New York, what is today New York City. And so there was slave trade, but people still thought it was evil. A lot of people did, some people didn't. And
I don't know if people really thought it was evil, and maybe Tom can comment a bit more on this on the historical aspect, but it wasn't like the abolition movement was also thought that African Americans were humans. They thought specifically, for any number of reasons, that slavery was wrong. Sometimes it might have not been. They might have thought it might not have been as profitable as it was. Maybe part of it was just because New Englanders, or just they thought their way of life was better and more correct than what those sick Southerners were doing.
Well, and generally they were right, but
you said even the abolitionists didn't believe
that
blacks were equal to whites.
Well, that doesn't necessarily correlate. It's not that there weren't pro-civil rights people in the abolition movement, but that doesn't necessarily mean every abolitionist also believed that African Americans should vote, African Americans should become citizens, have the same civil and equal rights.
Alexander Hamilton was a believer in, I mean, he was opposed to slavery, and also, I mean, he was born on St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, and he had seen slavery up close and thought that it was evil and that those people were human beings. Whereas, for example, so during the Constitutional Convention, you have people who do not want to have slavery. They did not want to have slavery allowed. And you had the southern states, particularly South Carolina, Georgia, were very strongly in favor of slavery. And that was a real big issue and a very big barrier to bringing in a constitution. Because a big split on it was, at the same time as they didn't want to give their slaves the right to vote in the South, they wanted the slaves to be counted as human beings for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives.
3/5.
That was where they came up.
That was the compromise that was reached. Yes,
because the North was like, no, you shouldn't count them because that would give them a huge number. I think it's worth pointing out that before the Constitution, we had an Articles of Confederation, and that's what the nation was at the beginning of its birth, more of a loose assembly of states rather than one collective nation. I mean, the states had so much power compared to the federal government. Any tax money the government got was because the states, basically gifted it.
And states would refuse to pay their share to the federal government if another state hadn't paid, and would get kind of snitty about it. And so the federal government was begging for money.
That's what we Republicans call the good old days.
Yeah, so there was slavery, there was no power for the federal government.
Well, Washington, D.C. wasn't even a city.
It was a swamp.
You're misquoting me.
Still kind of is.
I'm simply extrapolating from what you said, Paul.
The good old days.
But the Articles of Confederation were going to be... The Constitutional Convention, when it convened, was only supposed to make corrections and improvements to the Articles of Confederation, not do a wholesale replacement of the Articles.
Not every state even had representatives at that meeting.
I think it was...
there was one in Rhode Island.
And of 55 delegates who eventually attended, 73 originally were chosen. Patrick Henry refused to attend, saying that he smelled a rat at the convention. And so the convention met, and there were two compromises. One is the Great Compromise, and that's where you have a split between the House of Representatives and the Senate, big states, little states. But the other compromises all had to do with the issue of slavery. And the compromise that was reached was no new slaves could be brought into the United States after 20 years
Yeah, the slave trade was to be outlawed
Yes.
in
1809. It was 20 years after ratification of the Constitution.
Right.
But and I think the framers thought that the whole institution would be economically bereft by that point.
But by that point,
then we had Eli Whitney come along
And,
in his cotton gin.
yeah, and suddenly you had an industry that required really, really cheap labor. So,
Right.
But it was quite an innovation because prior to then, slavery was on a natural course to die out. I mean, let's not forget that Jefferson and many other Southerners thought that was the case, and so they weren't, tremendously opposed to the dying out of slavery anyway. And because it was no longer profitable, but when Whitney came along with his cotton gin, all of a sudden a dying institution that was, not profitable at all became tremendously viable and really embraced as a passion within the southern states.
And that's even the case before the Civil War starts. I mean, slavery was not something so common that every southern farmer had slaves.
No.
It was mostly the top major agricultural, the people who owned hundreds of acres of land and farmed that land. The smaller farmers that only owned a dozen acres or so, or even smaller, they might have had one slave.
less
At the most. Most of them had, and those people were working the fields just like everyone else. It was only the major plantations that really had slavery, even up until the Civil War.
less than half the households had any slaves, and most of the households that had slaves might have one or two slaves. Those were human beings. And they might not have been considered human beings at the time, but they were also very expensive to maintain. A human being and was an investment.
Food,
and
clothing, shelter.
You know that with your 3 kids there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this was in part of the reason that there was a stumbling block on abolition was the slaveholders in the South wanted compensation for any freed slaves, and that was something that Lincoln was considering
Yeah, that was mentioned in the book, I think, too, all lost property.
Well, yeah, there were several things that Lincoln tried to do in the beginning of his presidency. He wanted a way to free this.
And we'll get. And I shouldn't have mentioned Lincoln.
Yeah.
And we're doing the lead up. We're doing the
yeah.
lead up. And I apologize. That was my bad. There were compromises worked out in between. I mean, a question of whether new states would be allowed to hold slaves was a very bitter issue. And the Missouri Compromise was reached in 1851, whereby any new states south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Well, that was 1820 actually, but go ahead.
I apologize for that.
No, that's right.
Well, but the 1851 compromise because there was
What's up to 1851? What was it?
Technically 1850, where you had California coming into the picture with the gold rush, and essentially at that point it looked as if the northern states in population were going to overwhelm the power of the South. So you had to, at that point, a compromise had to be reached, which all well and good that it did, because it essentially put off the Civil War for 10 years at a time when, and probably with the president, that it would have been a very difficult fight indeed.
But this is where I have to sit here and say, well, we're at the end of the first segment. And we'll be back in just a minute.